So I'm going to quickly contrast these sort of more artistic and fashionable way of dressing with what's going to come next for menswear, which is hip hop, which is going to be huge and really transformative in the fashion industry. But just Yohji Yamamoto and Dries Van Noten. We'll talk about Dries when we hit the 90s. So Stephen Jones is a really important milliner, very active in the music scene in London in the 80s. Trained in a fashion school, and he worked for Lachaise, a couture house, but moved over into the millinery section. So he's made the hats for like every single high-end designer you can imagine, and he's a terrifically important 20th century and 21st century milliner. So in the 70s and 80s, you have the whole rise of hip hop, and I first saw Curtis Blow and the Mud Club in 1981. It was amazingly mind-blowing. It was like spoken street poetry to music. It was thrilling. I also saw NWA really early on. Um, but this kind of street style is going to be hugely profound for the fashion industry and for fashion in general. So here we have the group Run DMC in the 80s, and there they are on the right wearing their Adidas, and they're wearing tracksuit pants with an eclectic mishmash of what we would call active wear for being in the gym, um, on the street as high style fashion. So this is going to be the beginning of that athleisure wear. And speaking of athleisure wear, Norma Kamali was also doing it when she used sweatshirt materials to make really fashion forward garments. So here's Run DMC again, the really logo heavy, blazing on everything, which is very fashionable street style for hip hop guys. Here you see break dancers also wearing that athleisure style. It was not called that at the time, mind you, breakdancing. So Michael Jordan kind of single-handedly, his popularity was responsible, and this shoe design was responsible for, like, in part, all of this fascination with sneakers and this great sneaker craze that continues to this day, and that is part of this street fashion of athleisure wear. So I remember working with a guy. I worked in a restaurant, and he was a chef there, and he wore these to work. And if a speck of food got on them, he immediately cleaned it off. They were impeccably clean, and they are now a major collector's item. Okay, we would be remiss to not talk about the Jane Fonda workout. This was a huge aerobic exercise video that she put out, and it started this gigantic following. And you see Jamie Lee Curtis in the middle, and then another star from the TV show Dynasty in their workout gear. So this is workout gear circa 1980s. You wore tights and you wore a leotard as if you were in ballet class, and then the leggings, which you can see on Jane Fonda and on Jamie Lee Curtis in the middle. Big fashion statement in the 1980s. Dynasty was probably the most popular psychodrama on TV in the 1980s, about this gentleman on the left and his harem of women who would fight over him. But the gowns were designed by Bob Mackie, and if you want a slice of 1980s life, have at it. I don't really need to say anything here, right? Because this guy comes up in the midst. I mean, he reflects 1980s right now: excess, glitz, greed, power, lack of concern for the poor. Whitney Houston is a major musical star in the 1980s. You can see her in a crinoline style 1950s style garment with the big hair of the 80s on the left. And she struggled with drug addiction for the majority of her adult life and finally succumbed to it. Another film made by Dan Aykroyd on the left and John Belushi, the late John Belushi, was called The Blues Brothers, and it's these white guys imitating blues guys that the original guys that you're seeing on the right. The two gentlemen on the right are from England and sporting the pork pie hat and the skinny ties of, like, they're almost looking like mods from the 1960s. Eddie Murphy is like a huge comedian of the time, and he's so brilliant in the 1980s. So um, check out excerpts on YouTube. A couple of hairstyles from the 1980s. On the left is the style that Bo Derek, an actress, wore in the movie 10. Cornrows, directly lifted from the African American community. And on the right, the continuation of extreme punk hairstyles. Some of the artists who continued into the 1980s, the great Miles Davis and Andy Warhol, and the late and great Jean-Michel Basquiat. The late Keith Haring, whose dynamic drawings, he's an artist, R.I.P., who's succumbed to AIDS. This drawing is just so perfectly 1980s, frenetic and really big and bold and all over. But he was an important artist in the 1980s. Devo was a band in the 1980s, part of the New Wave trend, and the New Wave trend sort of featured the coloration from these new games, these new video games that you'll now see as retro games in video arcades, but they would always suit up. Their premise was that they were sort of a computer band, they were robots, not humans. And they were always featured in these suits and these big punchy colors. Madonna is not only a really important pop musician in the 1980s, that's her heyday, but she's also a really important stylistic trendsetter. This is back in the days where you didn't have a stylist. She would just layer necklaces and layer bracelets, and that really took off. A lot of people imitated it. She made the movie Desperately Seeking Susan with Rosanna Arquette, and that's also a really great period piece from the 80s. On the left, you have Madonna performing with her layered necklaces and bracelets and sporting lingerie with an overlay of sheer lace and lace leggings. And as you can see on the right, that sparked a lot of interest from the general public who were big Madonna fans who copied that trend. Michael Jackson releases Thriller in 1982, and that is a brilliant album, and it's a gigantic hit, and of course he's a whole style maven unto himself with the glittery glove. So two more musicians who are really sort of gender bending things. Robert Smith of The Cure on the left and Boy George on the right. And Robert Smith used to regularly wear lipstick and sport long hair, but it was really Boy George on the right who completely made up his face in the manner of a woman and braided his hair. And he was an English singer, really pushing androgynous boundaries way ahead of the trends that occur now, but doing it in a musical context. Prince was another musician who really loved to play with androgyny, so he would, wear really lavish purple colored garments and heavily bejeweled and ruffled, and you can see the lace and the glitter on his garments, and loved to play up that androgynous facet of his being while also maintaining a really masculine presence. And we're going to end on Prince, R.I.P. Prince. That's the end of the 80s.